Okay, we'll probably still have some people joining us, but are you comfortable getting started, everyone? Inês, most of all. Okay, well, first of all, welcome everybody to our final seminar of the term, and a very impressive speaker today. I was going to introduce Inês, but I'm going to turn that over to Hadi shortly because she has the welcome status of having been recommended by multiple people across students and faculty. And I only just learned that Hadi knew her quite well. Initially, I had gone on to and looked at her profile and said, yes, perfect. So, so welcome, Inês, first of all. And normally we begin with the land acknowledgement here. So I would like to acknowledge that UBC's Vancouver Point Grey campus is situated on the traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam people. And I also want to acknowledge that under the circumstances we're living with right now, many people are joining us from many places today, near and far. And so acknowledge to the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. Hadi, perhaps I will just turn the mic over to you to introduce Inês and give us some background on her career as you know it.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank Amanda for taking the initiative of inviting Inês. If I'd known, I would have done. I've known Inês since before she started her graduate career at Carnegie Mellon in the Department of Engineering and Public Policy. Those of you who know me well know that my intellectual mentor is Granger Morgan, who for a long time directed EPP. I once got an email from him saying, I found the next leader of this whole business of policy and technology and their interface. I said, what are you talking about? I said, he'd just come back from Portugal. He'd met Inês, and she was a candidate for the PhD program at EPP. And I'd never, ever, ever seen Granger more excited about recruiting someone to the program and having them be a collaborator in the various things that are done in engineering and public policy. So in short, Inês is, for me, a dear colleague who I've watched grow from being a graduate student to being an absolute star, commanding many, many different aspects of technology and policy, much of it focused on energy and technology at the frontiers of energy technology and so on, like her work on LEDs and then behavior and technology and policy. And she keeps expanding the frontiers of the space that she examines. Just like Granger, she seems to be tireless. And just like Jiaying, she seems to have more hours in the day than the rest of us. But you will see through her presentation that these are hours well spent in learning and then sharing with her rapt audiences. Without saying much more, I encourage you to listen in and ask questions.
Thank you so much, Adi. And I couldn't hope for a better introduction and such a nice one. I'm very excited about presenting this work. And I will say that all this work and the path until here would not be the same without folks like Granger Morgan and Hadi, who has from earlier on be a very good mentor and friend throughout these years with very sage advice. So thank you for that, Hadi. So today I'll be talking about multiple aspects related to sustainable energy systems and more broadly sustainability. And you may react immediately, oh, you have sustainable energy systems. Of course, you have to consider trade-offs and environmental justice and distributional effects per definition of what is sustainable. But the fact is that until very recently, some of those aspects have received much less attention than others. So the work that my students do, I'll say this way, given that they are the ones that really make this happen, is really in the broad areas of sustainable energy systems. So looking at the engineering and economic feasibility of sustainable affordable and environmentally just energy systems. And that through both the efficient use and supply of energy. And of course, we cannot think about that without taking into account the different types of policies that may be implemented or that are already implemented and how those affect the outcomes. So a second stream of research is to understand what are the most effective energy and climate change policies or other related policies that may not be in the umbrella of energy and climate change, but also have an effect in the related outcomes, and understand if the policies are achieving the intended goals or if they have important unintended consequences that need to be mitigated. And finally, we're people. We make decisions, we take behaviors. Some of those follow better or not so well what models would predict of different natures. So the third stream of research is to try to understand how people make decisions, why they behave the way they do, and what are the mechanisms and strategies that can be provided to do both informed decisions and to learn about energy, in particular in the realm of sustainable energy systems. And a lot of the emphasis in the last 2 years, and I think moving forward, for me has been on quantifying the environmental justice effects associated with energy systems. And this is thanks to a phenomenal group of graduate students at Stanford. They are working mostly on issues related to the grid and transportation sectors in the US and in India right now, as well as still very active collaborations with Carnegie Mellon University, with several students and their co-advisors working on both, again, transportation, the electricity sector, and air pollution consequences from US activities. And so with that, I'll start by presenting work that was done with PhD student Peter Chaufin and co-author Nick Mueller. Nick is an economist that has developed an air pollution model for the US economy in the vein of an integrated assessment model. And we were intrigued by the issue of whether the pollution consequences that are induced by different economic sectors are at the margin having a larger damage than the value they provide to the economy. That would be bad news because it would mean that we're not being efficient in the way our productive processes operate. At the margin, we'll have more damages in terms of premature mortality than the value we can extract from such production. So a little bit about context. Particulate matter is still the largest environmental health risk in the US and globally. Indeed, it is responsible for more than 100,000 fatalities just in 2016. And this number, the attribution of PM pollution to premature mortality comes with some uncertainty, with large uncertainty, but it is something in this ballpark. And it is associated with mortality rates from cardiovascular disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, and lung cancer. There are two main occurrences of PM, both direct fuel combustion, which will produce primary PM, as well as the emissions of SO2, NOx, which can react with ammonia in the atmosphere and form PM 2.5, resulting in secondary PM. And really those reactions in the entire balance is something that is quite difficult to model. And we rely in this work on fairly simple integrated and air quality model. And so it is always interesting to then contrast those results with more detailed air quality models that are developed by others, which folks developing the air quality models are starting to do. But that's a fairly recent effort. So our two questions are really, how have the effects from air pollution from economic activities changed over time in the United States? And how do the health damages from air pollution compare to the value added by economic activities? So I'll stress that we're not including greenhouse gases, and the effects from climate change related damages would amplify even our results on the total damages versus the value that the services provide. A little bit about data and methods. So part of this effort is really parsing out and matching data from multiple sources. So we rely on the Environmental Protection Agency National Emissions Inventory for the emissions of SO2, PM2.5, NOx, VOCs, and ammonia. These inventories are only produced every so often. And so at the time we used the three most recent years, 2008, 2011, and 2014. There is another recent iteration of the NEI that got released recently, and we'll be using that in future work. We use mortality rates from the CDC, information about population from the census, and then the final piece of information is the economic value added by sectors, subsectors, and industries for different activities, which comes from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So now that means that there was a poor PhD student, and that was Peter. So just for that, he already deserves the picture in that first slide, but he did so much more than that. But the first step was match the data from the Environmental Protection Agency notations and codes to the one from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And those are not the same. So he had to spend hours and hours matching different types of activities from one source and another. And realistically, that also brings some of the uncertainty in our results. Once that matching was complete, we're able to compute the monetized marginal damages from air pollution, and doing so by species and sources. And we use 3 reduced form air pollution models. I'll detail a little bit more about these models in a little bit. The results that you'll see are for AP3, and the results were generally consistent across the models. And in terms of outputs, we'll have this metric called GED, which is the gross external damages associated with an activity, industry, or sector by year for each of these 3 years. And then also this GED divided by the value added, or by GDP by year and sector. So gross external damages are the product of the marginal damages associated with a ton of original pollutant, and they will be a function of the source location, the type of pollutant itself, and the way in which they contribute to the formation of secondary PM2.5. We look at the emissions and damages by point or area source for each of the facilities in the United States and all of the area sources across the contiguous United States. So I already mentioned this part. So why is this sort of inventory of emissions and their differences important? So we have different types of sources for the emissions. So things like very large coal power plants will emit primarily SO2 and NOx, and they are having a very wide dispersion. We'll actually get a little bit into that in the second paper. And they can affect, of course, multiple countries or multiple states even in their dispersion. Whereas other sources of pollution, like industrial activities, also emit SO2 and other pollutants, and they may have medium to wide dispersion. And then you have things like trucks, which will primarily emit NOx and also direct PM, and they occur at the ground level. So the dispersion and exposure will be likely different. And finally, cars, which will emit NOx and primary PM, as well as VOCs, also occurring at ground level and often in densely populated areas. So the exposure to the pollution and resulting damages will increase. The marginal damages are computed using famous and infamous integrated assessment models. So these models go from having an inventory of emissions in the first run that goes from emissions to the concentration of PM at different locations. And then finally doing a perturbation on the model with each of the sources. So at every location we have a power plant, and here goes an additional ton of emissions of a particular pollutant, and let's see what happens to the concentration of the pollutant in this dispersion to the entire United States. And doing that one at a time, one of the sources at a time. This is where reduced complexity models really come into play. It's really difficult and computationally expensive to do so with more detailed air quality models. Whereas with this sort of frameworks, you can rapidly do many runs for many types of sources and all sorts of sensitivity analysis and even Monte Carlo approaches. So the population data and the dose response function are then used to estimate the number of premature mortality cases caused by the perturbation on emissions. And we use the values of a statistical life to then do the final and challenging part of monetizing the damages associated with air pollution. We could stop at the premature mortality, but with that, we wouldn't be able to do this comparison between the damages incurred by these activities by sector for different sectors and comparing the sectors with the value added from those activities too. So we do take that extra step. So a few key results. First, in terms of national trends, nationwide, the gross external damages attributable to the production between economic sectors has decreased from 22% by 22% over the course of just 6 years, so from 2008 to 2014. And these are big numbers. So it did decrease from $1 trillion to $790 billion. Again, uncertainty bars also should be produced in a figure associated with this, but the big picture is we're on the right track. There was a decrease in air pollution associated effects for US economy. These numbers are not small. So when we compare it to the size of the GDP, we're talking about 6% of the GDP back in 2008 and a little bit over 4% in 2014. But through 2014, the US economy continues on a path to become less pollution intensive, at least on the economic activities attributable to our operations. And importantly, when thinking about the future pollution control efforts, regulations, and policies, is the finding that nearly 75% of the gross external damages occurred in just 4 sectors of the economy. And those are agriculture, utilities, manufacturing, and transportation. So if we need to focus on any sectors, this is it. Of course, there is also the side on how much does it cost to reduce the emissions and the damages in these different sectors. But the overwhelming gross external damages comes from these activities. Now, in this plot, you'll see in a little bit, the vertical axis is the gross external damages in 2018 dollars in billions associated with different activities. You'll see the results attributing the gross external damages to the primary pollutant, so ammonia, NOx, PM2.5, SO2, or VOCs. And those will be parsed out by the economic sector, so agriculture, utilities, manufacturing, transportation, and others, and for 3 years for which we have the national emissions inventory data. So a few key messages. I already mentioned that the 4 top sectors contribute to 75% of total damages. Each of those big sectors exhibits falling damages over this time period. And the utility sector altogether, so this includes electricity production, oil extraction, and so on, it fell by more than 50% over just a 6-year period. And this is mostly thanks to the addition of air pollution control technologies for SO2 at coal-fired power plants, as well as closures of coal power plants and fuel switching to natural gas, and some effect, but very minor, from renewables. Agriculture is the economic sector with the largest sectorial gross damages in the US economy. And so this is something that has changed very quickly. If you look back in 2008, utilities had damages that were way larger than the ones from agriculture, but now rapidly agriculture starts to dominate as the key source of external damages. This is mostly from livestock emissions and fertilizer application, also due to other things like field burning and combustion emissions from agricultural equipment, but the big ones would be livestock and fertilizer. Finally, for the transportation sector, we see NOx and primary PM as being the key contributors, and also a decline over time in the damages. Part of this we'll see in the next slide, thanks also to a decrease in the damages from trucks. And finally, all other 16 sectors of the economy, including construction and so on, have the same magnitude of external damages as the top 4 sectors alone. So this is pretty relevant. You may notice a kink over here in 2001, and so this is likely the effects of the Great Recession and the decline in activities that occurred due to that. So I promised that we would look at the gross external damages and how they compare to the value added of different activities. So in a little bit, the figure will show dots for different types of subsectors for 2008, 2011, and 2014. Ideally, at the margin, we would like the activities from US economy to be on the lower portion of this plot. Ideally, potentially having a large value added, but not necessarily, but at the very least, to have something where the damages incurred at the margin are smaller than the value added by those activities. So let's see at what this looks like for the different years and for some of the subsectors. And we just illustrated for a few of the top sectors in terms of large magnitude of damages or of value added. And so importantly, we do see that for farms, the gross external damages for each of the years are larger than the value added. So you may react saying, okay, Inês, you're saying we can live without food? No, obviously not. But what I'm saying is that we can detect some inefficiencies in the way we are producing our food and potentially some opportunity to reduce those damages in a cost-effective way. We don't know. It will depend on the cost of deploying such strategies. But the indication that there should be a more careful look at farms and the related emissions and how to potentially reduce those. Second, we see that we had already seen previously that utilities all combined had been decreasing their gross external damages. And an interesting aspect is that they have been able to do so with no penalty to the value added. So there is a slight change also over here in terms of the external damages and the value added, but generally a really impressive progress in terms of emissions and resulting damages from the utility sector. Finally, we do see that the truck transportation subsector sees some decrease in external damages without a decrease in the value added too. So the activities continue and the value added is pretty much similar, but with a decrease, and part of this may be due to the new regulations for emissions from trucks. So a few key findings from this part. There are 5 key findings that I'd like to stress. The first one is at the level of national trends, economy-wide, the GED, the gross external damages from air pollution, have decreased by more than 20% from 2008 to 2014. Second finding being that the farm damages are now larger than the utility damages. And so while much of the air pollution policies to date have focused on the electricity sector, the damages from farms are now larger than those of utilities and have become the single largest contributor to air pollution. So a deep dive on the agricultural sector is warranted, and we're doing that right now. Finally, the concentration of damages of 4 sectors that comprise less than 20% of the national GDP are responsible for 75% of the gross external damages. And finally, some of the key uncertainties, in addition to the ones that I mentioned before, which go all the way from inventories of emissions and related data to the reduced form air quality models and their limitations, to end the value of statistical life assumptions and so on. In addition to all of that, there is higher uncertainty related to ground level emissions, because those emissions are usually estimated with models rather than measured. So there is really a need to understand the contribution of mobile sources and other ground level sources to the overall changing concentration of PM. And our results do suggest that policymakers should look at emissions reductions from the transportation sector and agriculture. There are a few considerations that are particularly important. The first one is that we're using this metric, the value added, and that's of course not the only way to measure the contribution of an economic activity to national output or even to contribution to society. Indeed, if we have a sector, for example, that contributes value to non-air pollution public goods, let's think about drinking water availability and quality, or having waste management and so on. All of those things are outside the value added. And so our gross external damages to value added ratios will overestimate the pollution intensity per unit of output. And so when we show these sorts of ratios and figures that contrast the gross external damages with value added, that in some instances are larger than unity, I really like to stress that this doesn't mean that we're calling for closing industries or activities, just an indication that more attention should be paid on whether there are inefficiencies that are quite high. And the evolution of the US economy towards a service-based economy, this is pre-COVID and thinking about the gig economy and issues like Uber and Lyft, make it hard to, or parcel delivery, make it really hard to attribute damages to those sorts of activities. There's really not a good way between the national emissions inventories to do so. So more data is needed there and new ways of tracking those types of activities. So we're now working on a piece that includes also the damages from greenhouse gases, as well as a deep dive on agriculture and farming. But the initial indication is that the damages from air pollution far exceeds the damages from climate change. So if anything, we should look at climate change and air pollution aspects together rather than in isolation. I'll very briefly mention a follow-up piece where I'll just list the findings, and we can discuss a little bit more in the Q&A on the regional and county flows of PM across the United States. This was work developed with Brian Surgeon. He's a former student and now a researcher at NREL, as well as Stephen Davis and Nick Mueller. And in that particular paper, we looked at the inter-county impacts of PM also for the 3 years that we had data for. And even though the emissions from point sources have fallen, as we've seen in the previous paper, the share of PM attributable to pollution transported from a county and state boundaries are still quite considerable in many localities. Indeed, we find that the benefits of reduced emissions are not uniformly distributed nationwide, with 26% of the counties concentrated in the South, Midwest, and Pacific Northwest experiencing worsening health damages since 2008 rather than improvements. And around 30% of all US counties receive 90% of their health damages from emissions in other counties. And these damaging importing counties also tend to have lower medium incomes. So these results support the continued state and federal cooperation to meet air quality standards and reduce the damages caused by PM 2.5 from the transported air pollution. I'll move on to a focus on the electricity sector. So in a piece in collaboration with Manader Ting, Chris Tessam, and Julian Marshall, we're looking at the distributional effects from air pollution in the United States. And so while we saw that the air pollution impacts from utilities and electricity generation declined over time, and that's good news, electricity generation is still a significant contributor of air pollution. And the existing estimates for electricity alone in the US range from 10,000 to 52,000 premature deaths per year. But up until this point, the demographic distribution of the resulting exposure to pollution due to production of electricity was largely unknown. So we tackled that. And we estimated the exposures to and health impacts of PM 2.5 from electricity generation in the US for each of the 7 regional transmission organizations, or RTOs, and for each US state and from and to a state, as well as by income and race. Once again, we used the same sort of integrated assessment models that go from emissions to premature deaths. In this particular piece, we didn't convert things in terms of dollar valuations of premature mortality. We do couple the model with census data on self-reported race and ethnicity by block group, as well as household income using ACS data. So jumping to the results, we find that over 16,000 premature deaths are attributable to electricity generation regionally. And putting this in a grim statistics, these are 4 deaths per terawatt hour of electricity generated. 85% of the premature mortality is attributable to electricity generating units, or EGUs, that are within the scope of an RTO. And 90% of the premature deaths are due to coal electricity generating units. So putting this into perspective in a map, on the right, you see the different regions and their percent of coal to total generation. And I'll highlight just a few things from the table on the left. The first thing is that regions as MISO and PJM that still have a lot of coal have the largest numbers of total deaths, as well as the highest mortality per terawatt hour of electricity, but also SPP with a very high intensity of premature deaths per terawatt hour. Now, do we all suffer the same consequences? And the answer is no. So this plot shows the deaths per 100,000 people from all electricity generating units PM 2.5 emissions. And so this does include primary and secondary PM, to be clear. And we'll show the differences for different races and ethnicities as listed in the census. So if we average across the population, we see an effect of 5 premature deaths per 100,000 people. But when we look at how this is distributed by race and ethnicity, we see that people that self-reported as African American or Black have a larger premature death per 100,000 people, followed by white non-Latino. This picture is very different from region to region. And so in the paper, though I don't present it here, we show the results for the different RTOs, and the story is not the same everywhere. But when we do look at this on a national basis, and we look again on the vertical axis, premature mortality per 100,000 people from electricity generation per household groups, let's see how things play out by both race and income. So not entirely surprising, we see that there is a decrease in deaths per 100,000 people for high income levels, but very, very small. But you do see that there is a small decrease over here towards the end. But there are key differences also by race and ethnicity. So the size of these bubbles corresponds to the population in the US of different race and ethnicities. And the levels would correspond to the exposure for the different income segments. So the key message here is that even as we look at a function of income, Black and African Americans experience more premature mortality per unit of electricity generated. That's one metric of what is going on in terms of environmental justice. There are other important aspects, which is how much of the pollution is caused or experienced in different locations. So in this first plot, we're showing the total deaths in each state from electricity generating units PM 2.5 emissions in the entire United States. So labeling this in a different way is how much premature mortality you have inside the state, regardless of where the emissions occur. Please ignore the significant digits here. The models don't have a way to get at this level of predictions. This was a kind of a discussion with co-authors. Just look at the color to see the ranges of and the magnitude of the premature mortality figures that we're getting. So we see that we have states like Pennsylvania, Texas, and Ohio that are suffering the most in terms of absolute value of premature mortality across different states in absolute terms. Now, when you look at the damages that are imposed by a state, and by this I mean the premature mortality that occurs between the state boundaries due to emissions from the state, a slightly different picture emerges. So we do still see that states like such as Pennsylvania and Ohio have large premature deaths, but the numbers are much smaller than in the previous slide, meaning the damages come from somewhere else. We also see that, particularly in Ohio, the premature mortality comes predominantly from other locations, given that the numbers decline quite a bit. The third plot now appearing shows the damages to others. So the total deaths outside each of the states that are attributable to emissions to the states. And once again, calling out on Pennsylvania and Ohio over here, which have very large numbers of induced premature mortality to neighboring states. And finally, looking at this in the perspective of net health damages to a state. And this is really the total deaths inside the state from total emissions in the state, plus the damages imposed to others, minus the deaths that occur in a state. And here you see the situation, for example, of New York, where the number of net damages that are imposed in the state is the largest amongst the country, despite the fact that virtually no emissions occur within the state. So some key findings, we find that average exposure appears to be highest for Black and African American people, followed by non-Latino white people, and the exposures for the remaining groups are somehow lower. The disparities between race and ethnicity continue to be observed for each income category, indicating that there are really racial and ethnic differences that hold even after accounting for differences in income. And this is mostly associated on, first, where are the coal plants located, but also where do people live and the distance from the power plant and whether that's downstream from the plume of pollution. The levels of disparity do differ by RTO, but we do see that the exposures are higher for low income than for high income, but that the disparities between the premature mortality intensity are larger by race than by income. And geographically, we observe large differences between where electricity is generated and where people experience the impacts from air pollution, with some states being net exporters of health impacts and others net importers. For 36 states, most of the health impacts are attributable from emissions to other states. And the bulk of this is due to coal. A final piece, which I'll go over. Am I still good on time? For a few more slides?
You have another 4 minutes.
Okay, that should be plenty. So looking at the decarbonization and cleaner air and the role of vehicle technologies. And this was work done with Fan Tong, former student that is currently at LBNL and moving back to China soon. The transportation sector has recently become the largest contributor to CO2 emissions. It is also a large contributor to criteria pollutants. And it has been shown to cause 110 billion in climate change and air pollution damages, with traffic-related pollution accounting for 20% of deaths from PM 2.5 and on-road vehicles causing climate change damages of a similar magnitude. So here we provided a spatially explicit assessment of climate change and air pollution damages for representative on-road vehicles in the US. And so the functional unit will be vehicles miles driven, and the reference year is 2014, though one of my students, Madalsa here at Stanford, updated all these figures for 2019 and accounting for also temperature effects and so on, and the results still old. So it's fairly similar to what we had seen previously for 2014. We do use a life cycle scope, and by this we account for the criteria pollutant damages and GHG damages from all the way from resource extraction, processing, transportation, fuel production, and all the way to the final fuel use. And the same thing for the vehicle manufacturing and the battery manufacturing. So all of those are included in addition to then the use of the vehicles. We do not account for the end of life of the vehicles and those associated impacts though. I'll jump over this one. Once again, we rely on integrated assessment models for air quality in the same vein of what we did previously, in this case easier. So we're using a different reduced form air quality model for each of the pieces that I presented today. And for greenhouse gas emissions, we had assumed at the time $36 per ton of CO2 in 2007 based on the guidance. But of course, we can easily see how the values changed by assuming different social costs of carbons. And we use a 100-year global warming potential for the other GHGs. So why is this important, and why do I keep on saying that we should look at climate and air pollution together? In this table, we're showing the weighted average life cycle damages of fuel and vehicle technologies across the US, and this is weighted by county population. And if you look at the first set of rows for passenger cars, what this table is illustrating is that if we were to look at just climate change, the technology that induces the lowest damages in cents per vehicle mile driven would be the battery electric vehicles. But as a decision maker, if you want to mitigate the damages from air pollution, then you'd pursue the adoption of gasoline hybrid electric vehicles. And finally, if you care about both climate change and air pollution together, given that those are two externalities to be considered, you'd consider the gasoline hybrid electric vehicles. But this is all weighted across the US, so let's see whether things differ a lot from region to region and county to county. So we compare and rank the fuel vehicle technologies by their life cycle damages for the same vehicle type in the same county. And in the next figure, you'll see the preferred fuel and vehicle technologies that would reduce the emissions the most if you're concerned, the damages the most if your concern is climate change, air pollution, or both. So here we go for an example. So for example, for cars, and if as a decision maker, you only care about identifying the technologies that help you mitigate climate change the most, then you'd see that in the large portion of the country that is in blue, whether that's light or dark blue, you'd already transition to battery electric vehicles, even under the current grid or the 2014 grid. And in all the regions that are in red, in the center portion of the country, you'd be better off by still using a gasoline hybrid electric vehicle if you want to reduce the emissions and damages from climate change. Now you see that there are different colors, different shades of red or blue. That just identifies whether there is a very large difference between the lowest damaging technology and the second lowest. So something that is really dark blue means that indeed the battery electric vehicles appear to be much better in terms of low damages to climate change when compared to whatever the second best technology is that could be picked. And so we did so for climate change, air pollution, and both. And what are some of the key takeaway messages? In some regions of the country, we already see a reinforcing of the best technology. So you have co-benefits where you look at air pollution, climate change, or both. You'd select battery electric vehicles in a portion of the country that is all together in blue. And similarly for regions that are red all across, once again, you have co-benefits or reinforcing your decision. But in other locations, your decision would switch as a policymaker if you're looking at air pollution, climate change, or both. Thus, the importance of looking at climate change and air pollution coupled together and comparing it to the costs of adoption of these technologies. So that's one limitation of this work. We didn't really look at the difference in technology costs or fuel costs for the driver, and that could come into play too. We performed the sensitivity analysis to the social cost of carbon assumed, as well as the value of a statistical life. So here you see in the vertical axis the fraction of US population that should be served by a specific technology and how that changes as we change the social cost of carbon and the value of a statistical life. And so for passenger cars and SUVs, the results are fairly robust and don't really change. So in terms of broad policy implications for passenger cars, our results suggest that battery electric vehicles are already the best solution for the Western US and New England for climate change, air pollution, or both. But in other regions, there are co-benefits or robust solutions. But in much of the country, there are still trade-offs between air pollution and climate change and what would be the best technologies. We also looked at the results under changing grid. And so as the grid gets cleaner, the solution will be electrify everywhere. But we're not there yet. So the issue is that we're not there yet. And of course, there may be a lot of reasons to induce the adoption of battery electric vehicles, even if the grid is not yet clean enough, because these things take time and we'll need to build the entire stock and find a way to get there. But regardless, if you think that you're being green by using your battery electric vehicle today, well, it depends on where you are and where you're driving it and what are you charging it with. So we're currently working on a sister paper for medium and heavy duty. So today I talked about comparing the gross external damages of activities to value added. We also looked at the different types of impacts from air pollution across income and ethnicity and race. And finally, also at the importance of looking at climate change and air pollution together. And with that, I'll end. I'll skip because I think I'm over time. There are a couple of other things that I'll be excited to show you. Hopefully that will be for an in-person visit. I'm extremely sad to not be there in person this year, and I would look forward to a visit and meeting you all in person. But a big thank you for inviting me for this seminar.
Thank you, Inês. That was fabulous and really wonderful look at these seemingly impossible to answer big picture questions, relationship between cost and consequence of those big sectors relative to themselves and to others. So really, that was fabulous. Thank you very much. As I mentioned at the beginning, Krishank and I will field questions. We tend to go with student questions first, and we'll start with 2 of those if there are any, and then move on to faculty or wider group questions. And I see a few in the chat. Students first. I see some hands. Hang on, let me just cycle here. Am I missing anybody? I don't think I'm missing anybody. And I don't see, Kushank, do you have a question? Do you want to start with the student questioning? And
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for an incredible presentation. You were great. I just wanted to, could you please speak a little to your plans on deep diving into agriculture sector and farms?
Yes, indeed. So we're now trying to understand whether we could do a better matching of the different activity level issues and where they occur than what we did in the first paper. And then comes a little bit of a tricky thing. So the way the damages are simulating in these reduced form models is really that an emission occurs at the centroid of a county, at least in some of the models. And that's problematic when you're starting to look at ground level emissions with less dispersion, and where even the population exposure may not be well reflected by the average population density in the county, right? So we're going to be we're actually still trying to understand what's the best way to do this. One of the issues that we talked about would be to move the source of pollution to an adjacent county and see how much that affects the results and so on. So we're taking different routes. None of those will be as good as I think using a more detailed air quality model. And so hopefully other folks are using that too moving forward. Yeah. This is not entirely satisfying as an answer, but that's where we're at. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see some names that I don't know, so you're going to have to speak up in terms of your status as student or faculty. But Ron, do you want to go next? And then go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I'm a student
Excellent.
in IOF. I'm just going to read my questions straight from the chat. I didn't know if that was going to go through. So thanks again for the talk. That was really interesting. It's something I'm really fascinated by. You alluded to the US transitioning to a service economy. And if part of that shift is an increased reliance on other countries for things like manufacturing or agriculture, countries which may have more relaxed environmental legislation, how might that impact our interpretation of declines in emissions and GED within the US? For example, if consumer behavior remains the same, but the source of the highest GED industries is sort of externalized to other countries, could that perhaps dampen the progress that we see when we look solely at the emissions within the US, if we broaden to like a global perspective?
Yes, so that's a good point. Though if you see for the top issues, unless we start having a lot of food imported from other countries, if the primary source is still in the US, then the things that we've seen for agriculture still prevail. For utilities, that problem doesn't hold because we are actually increasing the reliance on domestic resources. For manufacturing industry and other products, that could well be a concern. And indeed, that's not included in our analysis. And so if you assume that some of these products will be coming in from locations where the grid intensity is much higher for criteria pollutants and where air pollution controls are not into place, that would equate to much larger damages. I actually appreciate your question a lot, because ultimately that's what we should account for, not only what occurs between country boundaries, but premature mortality and climate change damages across different locations and their implications. It's obviously very challenging, and so we don't have yet models that allow us to do that. Chris Tessam and Julian Marshall are, and with several other colleagues, are developing a global INMAP model that hopefully in the future will address some of those issues, and that's really, really great news. So perhaps we'll get there. I would say that specific to some of the issues that you highlighted and that tie to green technologies and whether they are indeed sustainable and green, one of the things that we're looking at now is the fact that battery manufacturing for electric vehicles and even for stationary applications is not going to occur in the US. It doesn't occur in the US right now, despite the fact that most life cycle assessments consider that it does. So we're trying to track that entire supply chain and see how that changes the damages from air pollution and GHGs associated with electric vehicles, hybrids, and conventional vehicles. I hope this helped. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm just trying to, I'm sorry if I'm screwing up order here, but it looks like it's Naveen, Ramana, and then Milind, and then onward. Sorry, Amanda.
Sorry, I don't
Ramana.
think I had my.
No,
Yeah.
it's sorry. It's Amanda, Ramana, and Milind. Amanda.
Thank you for such an amazing talk. Just because Kushank already addressed some of the agriculture dimensions, I will yield my time to someone else, because that was what my question was about.
Okay.
I'll jump in then.
Ramana.
Hi, Inês, good to see you. Sorry you couldn't be here. I was struck with great talk. I was sort of struck by some of those pictures you had of premature deaths in these two states, and I was wondering whether that contributed to your moving from CMU to Stanford. Just a joke question, but the more serious question is about, so this is an environmental justice talk, or at least that's one of the parts of what your analysis. And in the early, in your first paper, you sort of talked about comparing the benefits and the costs of air pollution. And I'm wondering, and then later on when you started looking at the distribution of the costs of air pollution, the health costs, I didn't see a corresponding distribution of loss of jobs, for example, right? So I'm assuming that's also not going to be even. The most of the coal producing regions are in certain parts of the country and other parts of the country don't. So I wonder how that will complicate your justice sort of argument in a way. And related to that, you focus completely on air pollution. I'm wondering whether one should be thinking about water and soil and other kinds of aspects of pollution.
So to your first question on job implications, that's a point well taken. We don't include it in this analysis. In other work with Erin Mayfield and a few others, we did look at the job creation related with shale and whether that balances out other things. But not in this one. So this to say that, yes, that's an additional layer that it's pretty tricky, but that we could add in the future as yet another dimension of implications of these transitions. That's going to be a little bit muddled in when you look at these years because of the Great Recession, because you'll have that effect there that is going to confound everything else. But it's a good idea. I mean, yeah, it's a good idea to look at that too. And sorry, your second question was?
Air pollution versus other forms of pollution. Is there something to be, because if you want to switch to other kinds of energy, they will have other environmental implications, right? You kind of talked about batteries, for example, and a lot of the problems that have to do with mining and the kind of local impacts it has.
Yes, so I think all of those ideally would be important to capture. They may be more context specific in terms of the technologies or sectors that we're looking at rather than this big picture. But what I would say is that it's hard to think that any of those would have the same magnitude of damages that we're seeing for air pollution, with rare exceptions. So meaning tackling air pollution would be a big first layer. Do you're right. So there is all issues associated with materials being mined and the consequences for end of life too that we are ignoring. But still, I would argue we're capturing a very big, important chunk of it. Yeah.
Melinda.
Hi, Inês.
Hello.
Question for you. You had the graph showing different, for lack of a better word, racial groups and the environmental equity question there. Can you unpack that a bit for us? So if for African Americans, is it primarily just a historical accident or is it about hotspots? Just want you to unpack that, because even for higher incomes, it doesn't seem like the risk that African Americans face goes down.
Yeah. Yes, it's the way we build cities and the way they were historically segregated. That's what we're seeing, meaning I think it's still very much a result of that.
So legacy effects.
I guess I'm directly addressing your question, but I think that's the key thing. There is a strong association from what we see, though we should look at this much more carefully than my statement here. But in the areas that have poor air quality and where those neighborhoods were built, and the fact that there was a clear distinction on where people would be located. Yeah.
But that's insensitive to income. I mean, I would think that
that's insensitive to income, but
it's a function of urban infrastructure and where populations prefer to live, even regardless of income to some extent.
Because these are power plants, right? These are power plants. So the stuff is moving around.
The stuff
so you would expect that as incomes go up, you might see the effect going away. At least that would be my hypothesis.
Yeah, but we do not see that. Meaning, actually, let me pull back the slides so that we're looking at it. Wait, did I pass it? There. Yeah, so you see an attenuation slightly, but it's still there. And Hadi wanted to say something. I don't know, Hadi, did you have any insight or on this, or an unrelated question?
I do have a question other than this. I was wondering, so you're modeling on the county basis, right?
Yeah.
And so these reflect county population balances.
Yes.
And, you know, in a sense, historically, what we know is that different county compositions have been related to affordability of housing in that region. And so you just, you know, and often downwind is cheaper than upwind and all that kind of stuff. That's really basically what we're seeing is, so especially out in the Midwest, the air pollution was smelly.
Mm-hmm.
And so finding downwind versus upwind and the premium for downwind versus upwind was evident for all. And we're just, you know, revisiting that so long afterwards.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's going on.
If I might, I want to ask a question about graph 3, figure 3, which is the balance between damages versus, you know, net contributions to the economy. I think you mentioned it, but I want to ask a little bit more. You know, in a sense, I can say that from an economic activity perspective, these have been treated as being fundamental, right? So without, if I go to the EIO model, I'm not going to have any activities possible without a component of all of these, right? And so in a sense, I'm wondering if their true measure of value added is not something fundamental that cannot be measured along the x-axis as chosen. And whether you need something like, how in EIOs we use multiplier effects. I'm wondering if one could do the sum of the multiplier value of these things in order to see what the true VA needs to be, as a representation of their importance to economic activity. That's my question.
Yeah, and somehow related to that, I think this was Chris Tesson with Julian Marshall and a few others, and Jason Hill did this transformation for different types of consumptive uses. So all the way to that and understanding the contribution of PM for those end users. So that could be a way to go. And we do have a joint paper that also touches upon those things that I'll send your way. But you're right on, it's not exactly what you're saying in terms of just having the multiplier to have the value added, but it gets at the issue of all the way through the end use consumption, what are the impacts from pollution? Yeah.
We are running out of time, but I don't see a hand, and I'd love to ask a question. I found the graphs of importing mortality out versus receiving it in, those comparisons, just fascinating. Can you say a little bit more as to what the parameters were for what constitutes an export out of mortality?
So the way these reduced form models work is that indeed you go at one source of pollution at the time and see how that changes the concentration dispersion in the entire country. So imagine doing that one at a time for every source of pollution in that county, both from high stacks, from area sources and so on, and then measuring how much of the underlying damage from that incremental increase in concentration results in an incremental increase in premature mortality at each of the locations in across the states.
And that's it entirely. So it's basically a function of concentration and flow only.
And the type of facility. So if you feel like the large dispersion across states from high stacks and for ground level pollution, not so much. So actually it could be quite interesting, and we haven't done that, to see how these maps changed over the three national emissions inventories. Yeah, so we haven't
fascinating.
done that.
Insane labor in that, but fascinating and great visuals.
So I must say that in all of that, frankly, it's a lot of effort and labor, and that's all thanks to my co-authors and primarily the students. Yeah.
Good on them. Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't see any more hands up or questions in the chat. And really, that was terrific talk and a great also wind up to our semester of talks. So can't thank you enough, and hope with everyone else to see you in person sometime soon.
I truly hope so. So hopefully an in-person visit at some point in the next couple of years. Yeah.
That would be great.
Thank you all so much. Okay.
Thank you, Inês.
Bye-bye.